you very much for having us this morning. It certainly appears that the $100 billion target is getting a little bit tricky. Before we get stuck into it, would each of you like to introduce yourself? We've got a lobbyist, a farmer, an economist and a banker. Do we need to know any more, Mark Wiessing?
Well, that's how our joke starts, right? Just a quick introduction. Yeah, my name is Mark Wiessing. I've been on the job here in Sydney, Australia, as regional head for Australia and New Zealand at Rabobank. I was based in South America, in Brazil, for the last 8 years, responsible for that region. And I think just a quick mention that the way we do our business here in Australia is very much comparable to our business model in Brazil, in South America, close to the customers, and really looking forward to my years here and contributing together with our 12,000 Australian customers to reaching the 100 billion. Thank you.
Well, that's one vote for yes. We will meet the target. Jared?
Morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Jared Greenville. I have got the pleasure of heading up ABARES, which is the research bureau of the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. So we look at a range of things, and usefully and thankfully for the NFF, they picked up our numbers as part of their performance and the target, and we're I guess committed to continuing to try and look at ways and understand the sector and see what's driving performance and the like.
And Gillian, you're the real person in the room?
I am, yes. I'm a beef cattle producer from the far north of South Australia, 450 kilometres south of Alice Springs. We've got about 1 million acres there and roughly 5,000 head of cattle when we can count them, but it is a bit of a challenge. Also, I'm a proud graduate of the Diversity and Agricultural Leadership Program, and so thankful to the NFF for continuing that, and so pleased to see Fiona continuing as a patron. And when I did that program, I would not have imagined that I would be sitting on the stage at the NFF conference today.
Well, thanks for doing it. Tony, you've already been introduced a few times, so we might roll on, if that's okay.
Sure. No problems.
Have I upset you?
No problem.
I might say the Slido app is a go, so if you would like to put a question to any of our panellists today, please go head in through the app, and hopefully we've got enough time to get some answers to you. We might also get to a poll at one stage. I'm keen to get the feel for the room as to how many people think this $100 billion target is going to be achieved by 2030. Gillian, as a farmer, I wanted to start with you. How important is it, or what is the point of a target for your industry? How often do you think about it, and why is that important when you're trying to count 5,000 head of cattle in the middle of Australia?
I think as a producer, as a farmer, these sorts of lofty goals and those sorts of things, they seem too far for us. They seem too far removed from our day-to-day business of keeping things alive, of harvesting the crop, of growing the fruit and vegetables. But I think it's super important to have these sorts of goals and targets, and that's why we need the NFF, and that's why the NFF is important it's the leadership piece. The leaders are meant to be looking over the horizon and doing that sort of hard work for us to ensure that we are sustainable, productive, and we stay in business. And that's why these goals that are set for our industry and an entire agricultural industry, because we're all one big complex ecosystem. We can't be butting heads against who's more important, sheep or wool or grains, because we're all part of it. We need these targets to help us drive investment, to increase our efficiencies, to give us something to aim for. And that's the role of the leadership of our representative and advocacy bodies, to do that sort of stuff on our behalf.
But are many people where you farm talking about it?
I don't think anyone where I farm would even know it existed. But it's the trickle-down effect, is that, you go to the MLA, Meat and Livestock Australia, who's our RDC, our body that invests in our development of our industry, and you can say we need to meet this target, so we need to be looking at things that help us improve our production, that help us make us more resilient to climate change. We need to be getting better yields, we need to be improving these sorts of things. And again, that's a leadership piece that not everyone has the time for, but it benefits the entire industry.
And Jared, what's been the role of this target, which was raised by industry but has bipartisan support, both sides of politics? You've been working for the government's commodity forecaster under a coalition government, now a Labor government. Does it inform the work that you and the other economists are doing?
Yeah, I think certainly in a similar way to what Gillian was saying, that it's a way to kind of focus where, I guess, policy effort's going, and does it, does it contribute to the task at hand? And I think one of the things that we saw when it first came in was really this, I guess, look across the policy suite that existed and a reframing as to, well, if government's in support of this, how are these policies going to help? How are they going to contribute? And that made us kind of look closely at, well, what are the barriers that exist to growth? And as Tony kind of pointed out in that chart prior to the target being set, the quantity of production in Australia at the time hadn't grown for the last few years. It'd been pretty flat. And so it gave us an opportunity to take a cold hard look at things like productivity, how markets were working, what are those fundamental drivers, and policy suite kind of fit around that, and gave the government kind of a way to target that narrative around that, and then gave us as a research bureau license to kind of go and look under the hood.
Got the narrative. That's, I guess that's an important part of it. Tony, having set this target, do you have any regrets at the NFF?
No, none at all. It's been, we've been delighted about how it's been picked up. I mean, we hoped it would get traction, and I absolutely appreciate that Gillian's not talking about it every day when she's chasing her 5,000 cattle. That's not necessarily what it was intended on doing. It was intended on doing a job that Gillian hasn't got time to do. It was intended on bringing the industry together, having a whole of industry target, and then allowing people to tailor it and apply it to what they thought it would mean most meaningful to them. And importantly, it was a message to government to say, industry's going to have a crack at 100 billion. Are you with us? You want to have a go with us to try and get there? And all governments, and I have to say, all the supply chain has said, yes, we're with you. And I think that's valuable.
And I know there's been a lot said already this morning about the NFF's disquiet with the government's policies of late. I don't want to get stuck into that, but doesn't that sort of make the roadmap less relevant if the people who are making the policy decisions aren't referring to that? It's almost like lip service saying we want you to be $100 billion, but here are these policies that go against the grain of what you've been promoting?
I think it's a tool to actually say to government, you've signed on to this, and it goes way beyond the $100 billion target, right? As I said, there's a whole lot of aspirations and actions and metrics in there, and they align absolutely with the policies that we've got in Keep Farmers Farming. It's not... They're not, completely made up. They align with what's in the roadmap. So we'll continue to use that as a tool to get good outcomes.
And Mark, given your experience in South America, and I know you've been in Asia and parts of East Africa as well, I think, is this something that you see other industries doing, setting these targets, setting these roadmaps, and thinking about what's really coming next?
Well, I think in most countries, agricultural countries, you would have bodies like the NFF and the whole ecosystem around it. And each country would have a different level of integrated leadership or coordination, but essentially the same things are happening in other countries. And talking about the numbers, the 100 billion, I agree. I mean, it's kind of a dot on the horizon that kind of mobilizes farmers, government in a certain direction. So it's not the number itself, but it's more the mobilization, the ambition, the appetite that we have to grow in a certain direction or address some of the issues that we have. I think it's important to have those discussions. And despite the feisty start earlier this morning, I think we believe in facts and data and open discussions and understanding of the trade-offs that are always necessary to achieve practical solutions.
You talked a little bit about similarities in the banking system, I think, between Brazil and Australia. But what about the actual production systems? Are the producers they're facing the same kinds of issues. And questions coming through about biodiversity and climate change. I might ask about that in a minute. But is it similar policy areas across the globe?
Well, I think one of the earlier speakers mentioned something about the volatility in South America. So if we speak in Australia about interest rates going to 5% over a period of time, in South America, in Brazil particularly, we went from basically 1% to 13% in less than a year. And the farmers are still farming. So I have a total confidence that despite some of the issues that we're facing here in Australia currently, whether it's interest rates or the geopolitics, that farmers will continue farming. In terms of the other issues that you might face, I think, and I alluded to that earlier, we're dealing with the same type of commodities: animal protein, beef, chicken, pork. They're global producers. Some of them have migrated here, as we know. Grains, cotton. So we're in the same global markets and often facing similar issues around, obviously in South America, deforestation topics, but also ultimately the topic of emissions and how that's calculated.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And particularly, we've got a free trade agreement with the EU on the cards at this very minute, and the NFF's been quite critical of the government's approach to that. But South America, great competitors, of course, to get into the EU. Jared, you might be a good one to come to ask about how climate change and biodiversity loss, things like that, and probably not just climate change, but policies to mitigate climate change, are perhaps likely to affect that target of 100 billion.
Yeah, I think what we've seen already in the past is that changes in our climate over the last 20 years have had an impact on our ability to produce, but we've still produced, as Mark was saying, we've still produced, and actually what we've seen is what I'd say a strong growth in underlying productivity. And that's when you take out some of the climate signal and you try and work out what's going on underneath. You can see the productivity is growing, and that's because we've made some pretty smart investments about, in our R&D systems and innovation and the like. And so we've helped kind of tread water and keep pace with where climate's gone. And then obviously with the pressure relief gone over the last 3 years, you've seen that explode out into a $92 billion sector.
You talk about innovation there. Somebody I was talking to this morning told me, and probably people in this room are very familiar with this, but in the last 3 years, Australia's sheep flock has grown by 23% to its largest level since 2007. That's some good innovating, isn't it? That's not just rain.
It's there's improved genetics across kind of livestock industries. There's better focus on what attributes you want out of your livestock as well, and same with grains. So you've got this combination, and so people are, I think, really getting more and more able to take advantage of good conditions when they come along, and that's what we've seen in good prices and that response. I think what we've got going ahead is then, okay, well, we've seen an up and we've seen down. How do we deal with this increased variability? And at the moment, our markets are trying to price in higher supply and lower demand, and we're seeing prices crash in some. We've got geopolitical uncertainties where we've seen a bit of a bumpy ride. And how do we make sure that our supply chains and our production systems are a bit more aware of the impacts of that variability and be able to manage them? And I think that's going to be key. And that goes to climate, goes to biodiversity, goes to the full range of kind of factors that are going to influence.
Gillian, what about the impact of climate change policies? The things like we've seen around the world, some jurisdictions limiting fertiliser use, a methane tax in New Zealand. I'm sure there are others I just can't think of at the moment. Are you concerned that could interrupt Australia's ability to hit that $100 billion target?
I think that's the biggest threat to agriculture in Australia at the moment, regardless of interest rates or seasons or anything like that, is poor policy decisions made on the back of populist politicians wanting to be re-elected and pandering to activist groups and pandering to inner city people whose lives don't rely directly on making a living from the land. I think that's probably the biggest risk that we face, because those sorts of policies that are talking about limiting fertiliser use or limiting herd size or any of those sorts of things, they're not going to deliver what we need to do to have a meaningful impact on climate change anyway. And I read a statistic the other day, which may or may not be true, because I did read it on the internet, but apparently 6% of global emissions are from agriculture, and that feeds the world.
What do you think about that, Jared? 6%?
I mean, I think there's various numbers out there, and the FAO has a higher number, but it's the point is the one that's made, that I think dealing with food and feeding and clothing people, and also with emissions from agriculture, requires a global approach. And Australia, I think, is actually quite well placed, given our emissions intensity, given our sustainable production systems and the like, to contribute to both objectives, to feed people, to clothe people, but also to reduce global emissions from agriculture. And I think that global policy settings are going to be pretty important in not driving some of these kind of perverse outcomes that we're talking about.
Mark, I want to ask you, if we come back to this $100 billion target, can you tell us about Rabobank's expectations for the medium term, given we are coming into a drier period and we've seen such a downturn in livestock prices?
I think Australia has gone through many of those cycles. So depending on the depth of the drought cycle, my understanding is, and my expectation is, that we'll come through it.
When?
Sorry?
When?
Whenever it starts raining. Yeah. I think overall these cycles have their average lifetimes also, and I think going forward, if you look at the sector, it's been used to getting through those cycles, and I think it's important for the value chains that are involved in that and that might be impacted, is that we need to keep in agriculture always a long-term view on the business. We cannot enter and get out when we want. So we know certain parties want to get out when the going gets tough and then come back in when everything looks okay. From our perspective as a bank, we have that long-term view. We must have that long-term view to keep supporting our customers.
And one of the questions that's come through is actually about alternative revenue streams available to farmers during the drought and the downturn in prices. Would you like to have a go at that question, or should we defer to Tony?
I'm okay to at least give a partial answer, and perhaps you're
kick it off, and Tony can bring it home.
perhaps you're referring to carbon credits, for instance, or trees for farmers. I think these are, of course, opportunities, definitely. But if you look at the broader perspective of what's happening, I think farmers also need to be aware that they're part of an ecosystem that ultimately needs to report on their total emissions. And I'm referring particularly to the fact that, for instance, if you engage with the large stock exchange listed companies here, the retailers, your international traders, the off-takers abroad, they have targets on emissions. And for many of those, 95% of their reported emissions are actually the farmers' emissions. So before we tell farmers, so that's the so-called Scope 3 emissions, before we tell farmers to actually sell their carbon credits for cash, they also need to make that trade-off and understand very clearly if it's more important to have cash now or to have on your own farm your own carbon credit rights, your offsets, your insets on your farms that you can use to have a meaningful discussion with the retailers, the consumer companies. I think that's very important. And I think it's very important that our farmers are educated to understand these trade-offs. We're doing our part. Over the last year, we've done at least 50 or 60 workshops with over 1,000 farmers to help them in those discussions around understanding the dynamics of Scope 1, 2, 3, what it means to actually sell your carbon credits. And we're also now seeing that the large corporate customers in the food and agri space that we have are actually wanting to participate in these discussions, in these workshops, because they depend on the farmers for their own reported emissions. Very important.
And given your global experience, are there some markets that are doing it better than others in terms of carbon credits?
I think each country has its own. I think we're in a space where there's a lot of experimenting, right? I think there's a lot of errors being made, but there's also good things happening. And we just need to be careful always that whatever policy we put in place doesn't achieve or result in perverse kind of consequences. I'm new to the region, but the example that I'm being given sometimes is around New Zealand, where a lot of farmers are encouraged to plant trees, therefore reducing planted area of that benefit feeding the world, and therefore at the same time also weakening the local communities, because planting a forest doesn't require many people. Planting wheat or
Trees
commodities.
can't work in the hospital or the
Yeah,
school.
so it has an impact on your communities also. So beware of what your policy decisions, whether the micro decisions at farm level or country level decisions, be aware of the consequences. Yeah.
Okay. Mark's gone there to carbon credits, Tony, but what about looking at something like solar panels or wind turbines as an alternative form of farm income to help offset the challenges of the drought?
Well, that's already happening. It's already a part of many farmers' enterprises on their business. Couple of things. What's happening at the moment is a government policy is driving, charging towards a renewable energy target, and there's unintended consequences in that. So there's some learnings and some corrections that need to take place in that policy. There is definitely some income streams and some risk management strategies that can be addressed through solar or wind, but there are some real challenges with what's happening at the moment across the country. The other thing I'd say is that carbon, and Mark's right, I mean, it's a step. I would say, let me characterise it this way, carbon I would say would be a step towards a greater prize. I think that it's a first step towards, natural capital, biodiversity, ecosystem services, whatever they might be. But the biodiversity, the natural capital credits that farmers are looking after, we need to get a whole lot of work around measuring that and identifying what it is, and then start rewarding farmers for it, and that we can develop a bit of a market. So there's heaps of work that needs to be done, but that's where the prize
I
is.
feel like we're just warming up and we're
I
already
know.
getting the wrap up.
Yes.
Before we go, Jared, when you look at farm incomes, do you factor in income from things such as wind turbines or carbon credits?
So we ask about it and we collect it, but we don't factor it into
So we could be at
what
100
farm
billion already.
income. So that's right. But it's only about 6% of farms actually had an income stream last time we asked that came from, alternative markets for things on their land, like we're talking about. So it's still, the numbers are still small.
Okay, well, we have got the wrap up. There is a poll online. If you want to go to Slido, let us know whether you think Australian agriculture can hit 100 billion by 2030. Thank you so much to our panellists today, and enjoy the rest of conference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kath.
Thank you.